If you are a speaker and not a participant, please turn on your cameras so that everyone can see you. It's great to have you all joining us. I appreciate it very much. The COVID-19 pandemic has included more than 55 million cases and 1.3 million deaths in 191 countries to date. And as many as 20% of these may be in the US alone. And so over the past 2 weeks, since the US presidential election, when it was, as it has been confirmed that there was going to be an administration change in the White House as Joe Biden takes over the presidency from Donald Trump, it's a really good time to take stock of what's happening at a health policy level in response to such a global tragedy. Around the world, public health policies and responses to the pandemic have sort of been either implemented from a centralized and national control, or they've been delegated down to a regional health authority for implementation. And these policies have to date, generally speaking, included economic or societal shutdowns, masks and personal protective equipment implementations, and social distancing. It's my pleasure to introduce all of you today to three experts in data policy, in privacy law, and in digital transformation to really discuss this topic with us. And I'm hoping that it's going to be okay by everyone if I start by asking all three of you to sort of try and give us some of the lay of the land. I want you to weigh in on where you see us and our society at the moment, and from your perspectives, sort of what is the current state of pandemic response in all of our societies? What is the role that is being played and that ought to be played by eHealthcare and by digital tooling in pandemic response? And where ought our response to COVID-19 go from here? I'd like to start with you, Professor Yoo, and then move to hear from James and Shaun. Maybe if you wouldn't mind, maybe you could introduce yourself first quickly and then give us some of your starting thoughts.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thank you for having me, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. So I'm a professor of business at Case Western Reserve University, Cleveland, Ohio. And I also have a visiting appointments at London School of Economics and then Warwick Business School. So my area of research is digital innovation, and big chunk of my work is focusing on the use of behavioral trace data to generate useful insights for business to engage with users. So I'm looking at contact tracing and COVID from that perspective. There's a tremendous opportunity to use the behavioral multidimensional personal data to help individuals to get better in health in general. What I think this pandemic has done, first of all, I hope that the switch of administration actually that does happen on schedule, on time, without any hitch. And Thanksgiving is just around the corner, and then two major companies, pharmaceutical companies, announced that they have a very promising vaccine. So I think there are a lot of things that we can be thankful next week in the US, even though the current news is really bad. But what I wanted to say was that there is this old saying that no crisis should be wasted, and I think this pandemic, from a digital health perspective, really revealed both the opportunities and the weaknesses of digital technology as it is currently used. And the privacy and the equity and all of these are some of those issues. I think I really like the way you started. I would just leave it at that. Like a smart, targeted containment strategy is, I think, what the society needs, and we have technology that can help. Technology alone is not a solution. It has to be aided with other policies and other behavioral changes. But technology does provide that very targeted, support. But like I said, the current technology regime can create a lot of obstacles of deploying the technology in such a way. So I will stop here, and then I will turn it over to Shaun or James. I think it's James. Yeah.
Shaun, that'd be great. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that, Jonathan. So my name is James Kingston. I'm the VP for Research Innovation Partnerships at Dataswift. It's been a fascinating time. to be involved in innovation, given all the many applications that have been developed around COVID-19 and all the many concerns and questions that have been thrown up by them. We've did quite a lot in relation to contact tracing over the last few months. We won a grant from Innovate UK, the UK funding organisation, to develop, in collaboration with Case Western University and indeed Youngjin, a particular application, and also called ShareTrace for contact tracing purposes of sort of privacy at the forefront. Alongside that, part of our application, part of our grant, I should say, was to do research on the overall landscape of digital contact tracing, which has led to some quite interesting lessons on our part on how this space has very rapidly evolved in recent months and the kind of policy questions that have thrown up. It's been a really, really interesting period for anyone with an interest, both in, app development, app architectures, but also the ethical and policy considerations that come into that. You've had the kind of battle for supremacy between different architectures, particularly those based around Bluetooth and based around GPS. The quite fascinating, to some quite worrying power that has been taken by Google and Apple in relation to the permissions they allow people to go onto the App Store and what that says about the kind of designs that could be used in facing the pandemic. And then the various decisions being taken by governments around this time, all of what this means for privacy, control of your data, freedom, autonomy, all these quite major questions that we've been forced by the pandemic and contemporary technology to consider. So I have a lot to say on all of these, and I'm sure everyone else does too. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion today about these and other points.
Okay, I guess that's me. So my name is Shaun Brown, and I'm a partner with nNovation LLP. So we're a law firm based here in Ottawa, Canada. I've been working in the privacy space for about 20 years, about half that time as a lawyer. Where to even begin with this subject? I'm making an assumption that most people attending today are in the US. On the state of the pandemic, generally speaking, Canadians tend to be a little more deferential to government. We're less concerned on the whole about what our individual liberties and what types of things may be lost if we allow the government to dictate anything in our lives. I see we have somebody from Greece. So with that in mind, most Canadians were generally okay with going along with what governments initially tried to do to shut down this pandemic. Temporary lockdowns, use of masks, these types of things weren't seen as controversial, at least in the early stages. But at this point in the game, we're seeing a lot of COVID fatigue in Canada. It just like you have in the US, and people are getting really fed up to the point where you're seeing a lot of people quite upset about this, and even in questioning whether COVID is even real in the first place. So how that relates to technology, I think it's worth clarifying that when we talk about contact tracing, this can be put into two broad buckets. We have the traditional contact tracing that's done by public health officials, which is very much a manual process, but it can be supplemented by databases and other systems that allow them to do their jobs more efficiently. And then we have these applications that James referred to, the Apple Google model, broadly referred to as the exposure notification, to try to distinguish it from that more traditional types of contact tracing. So we have the federal government built an app based on the Google, Apple exposure notification layer. It's been implemented by most of the provinces. Healthcare delivery is a provincial responsibility. The federal government doesn't have a lot of responsibility outside of essentially funding it. I just did some really quick math. According to the federal government website, the app that the federal government created which has been implemented in 8 provinces and territories, has been downloaded by roughly 5.3 million Canadians. That's about 14% of our population. So that actually sounds quite good. But then when you look at the number of notifications that have gone through the app, so these are individuals who've been diagnosed and decided to upload their keys through the app and notify other individuals who've been in contact with them. There have been just over 5,000. So that works out to roughly, less than 2% of all cases in Canada have resulted in a notification through that app. So I think it's pretty clear that at least in Canada, the exposure notification side of things, those applications aren't being widely leveraged and probably aren't having much of an impact on the response in Canada at all. So I'm going to leave it there for the time being.
I'm actually going to pick you up on it right away, if that's okay, Shaun.
Sure.
With that in mind, do you think that there's a ruling that can be made on digital tooling overall and its role in sort of helping us to combat the pandemic? And can we say whether it's been effective in any capacity?
Well, absolutely. The systems that are used by public health officials are crucial to making their job easier, because that is such a laborious, time-consuming manual process. Really crucial. But to pick up on one of Professor Yoo's points, there's potentially a lost opportunity here in terms of the use of technology, but also being able to learn from this process for the next pandemic that comes around. That's where I really see technology having an important role, because I think if we're learning anything, and this is kind of outside of my expertise as a privacy lawyer, but just kind of general observations, is that it seems pretty clear we need to get on these things really, really quickly with a really robust, hard-hitting response, because if we don't get to it early and it drags on, people are just going to be sick of it, and they're not going to buy into anything that the government tries to do. So I would really like to see as much effort as possible to try to evaluate these technologies with whatever data is available and improve on them and be better prepared for the next pandemic that comes around. Because I think that technology, like the exposure notification applications, could be really, really crucial in avoiding those harsh shutdowns that really affect everyone's lives.
Jonathan, if I may just jump right in, I love to think about post-pandemic world, but I'm not really sure if that will happen, given the nature of this disease and how pervasive it is. Even the vaccine comes around, no one knows how long the immunity will last, right? So that has been the case for, common cold, which is also based on the same family of viruses. So the speculation is that it may just linger around our society for an extended period of time. And then, for sure, there will be other forms of, pandemic like this. It's in a way, it is man-made, disaster disease that kind of like a living conditions we created in wild animals and so on, and global integrations and so on. So, I think it is prudent to assume that to a certain extent, even after a certain level of herd immunity is achieved, we may still need to live with a different lifestyle. And, so what does the technology may or may not be able to do as a part of our society? I think this is where I think we really need to think about it. This is, if I make a bet, which I'm not very good at, but, if I'm making a bet, the chances are, if you look at the corporate world, the companies will have to protect their workers coming into their, the offices and factories, their store visitors, the clients coming in, restaurants and Uber and airlines. So I think we will be seeing a not necessarily national, government policy-wise, more like a business-driven cost of doing business, and creating some form of a protective layers that allow them to run their business. So and technology, I think, really can do it. This kind of like an exposure notification, the one that we built and then being commercialized with our commercialization partner right now. The hope is that we'll get to a point where we can quickly exchange our pandemic score or risk score. It's not definitive, yes, he has it or she has it or not, or so, but it's a risk profile that we can quickly exchange in a privacy preserving way, and then allow people to transact in a way. I mean, I think when we say the fatigue, this is what we want is we want to interact with people. We want to participate in economic and activities. That's what people want. My 25-year-old son is trapped in his apartment for God knows how long, and he is yearning to go back to office, interact with his colleagues, and having dinner and having real life, right? And I think that's what people want. And so I think maybe we are going to see a layer of technology that is now baked into our social infrastructure, our business infrastructure, just like website, just like email. And I think and I think this is where I think potentially a beachhead in the US case, potentially using digital technology to control the cost of healthcare overall. If we could use digital technology to avoid pandemic or run the business in a more healthy way, we can also do other things as well, chronic conditions and so on. So I think maybe this is an opportunity for us to think about it. Again, how we actually design and communicate the role of technology. I think that's important.
James, we're getting into your wheelhouse here a little bit, because what Youngjin's talking about is, effectively stepping on what used to be, or I think many of the public would agree, was the purview of the government or the state to protect and to sort of support the population. And it kind of sounds like what you're saying, Professor Yoo, is that it may not be the government's job to do that. It may be private enterprises' job to start to step in and take on some of that role. Would you say that speaking to some of the power dynamic shift that you were talking about in your opening?
Yes, I think it's certainly a very fascinating. It's certainly a fascinating moment. One of the things that this pandemic is revealing, both in relation to the applications themselves, and then in terms of the some of the associated phenomena such as misinformation and conspiracy theories, is trust. The nature of institutions and the trust that we place in institutions, and the trust that we believe in the messages. The trust that we have in the messages that are coming all around us. The pandemic is putting all sorts of institutions under severe strain. And that's what's very important to realize when you talk about technology, because technology does not exist in some sort of void, some sort of platonic ideal of a contact tracing app, which is out there, inert in ontological space to be pulled down and used. It's always a socio-technical system, to use a term that really trips off the tongue. Any app is embedded within a particular context. It could be a country, it could be a city, it could be a workplace. And all of the norms and institutions that are in those places will influence how we use the apps. Something really interesting went on, particularly in Western countries, in relation to use of these applications. And we've mentioned it a couple of times now. Which is the Google-Apple protocol. So Google and Apple were basically able to dictate to the world a lot of quite important things about the nature of states' public health policy responses. So firstly, they said that every jurisdiction, firstly they said country, then they realized there was federal countries, and they then said jurisdiction, got a bit confused. But either way, a ruling was made. Every jurisdiction could only have one app. So that immediately disempowered a lot of app creators. Secondly, they said that if you want to use Bluetooth proximity checking for contact tracing, then if you wanted to use their API, then you had to use decentralized processing according to this particular protocol they outlined. What that means is that the two most trusted creators of devices, who have the two most trusted marketplaces and get to set the rules on who goes into the marketplace, the app stores, that is, basically told sovereign states what their response should look like. What you had was very interesting, therefore, in Europe. You had Britain and France attempting to build apps that they intend to be more privacy preserving, hence the use of Bluetooth, but that would still pull in centralized data for the purposes of research and being able to fight the pandemic and similar pandemics later on. Google and Apple said no, really stymieing the creation of those apps. So the states were forced to use Google and Apple protocol in the way that Google and Apple wanted, which it represents a real power shift. But one of the things that's quite interesting about all that is the fact that the population doesn't really seem to have minded in a lot of countries. They've kind of almost trusted Google and Apple more with use of data and with things being private than they would their own states. What that's led to is the widespread, or relatively widespread, because of course no app has actually really shot through, broken through in terms of downloads, is the relatively widespread use of Google Apple-based applications. But of course, much though they get called contact tracing applications, they're not contact tracing applications. They are simply exposure notification systems, as Shaun mentioned. These tools rely on Bluetooth working. They rely on people putting in whether or not they've had a positive test result. They rely on testing standards. They don't actually provide data needed for proper digital contact tracing that mimics in a digital sense what used to be done manually and still is done manually. So yeah, there's a lot to say. I realize I've just thrown out quite a lot there, so I'll shut up. But yeah, it's fascinating and worrying.
Shaun, when you're looking at sort of the landscape of the law in regards to privacy, how much does any of that stuff shake down into what's actually going on? Does it matter what is sort of capable from the corporate angle in these kinds of technologies? Do the consumer rights change dramatically if the power base shifts from corporate to government or government to corporate? Or on a legal level, is all of that sort of noise and it all comes down to sort of individual jurisdictions' actual laws?
So with what we've seen so far with the exposure notification, they are designed to be so respective of privacy. They don't collect any personal information, any personal health information. They fall completely outside the scope of privacy legislation in Canada based on the way that they function. You could argue that some aspects of the implementation, the relationship directly between the user and Apple and Google, there are some privacy law aspects there, but really it has no impact on the functioning of those applications themselves. So we aren't even close to bumping up against any legal restrictions in terms of how those technologies have been used in Canada. And governments have very broad latitude to be able to implement technologies that do actually use more identifying information. They have broad authority under health privacy legislation, which varies between jurisdictions. We have public health legislation, which can provide for pretty substantial authority to collect and gather information when they need to. When you look on the corporate side, employment relationships in a lot of jurisdictions in Canada aren't regulated by privacy legislation at all. So there's a lot more that can go on in that context without being subject to any legal scrutiny whatsoever. But I just want to touch really quickly on the element of trust, because I think that's crucial here. And that's a really, really big challenge, because the government has created this app which is so respective of privacy to the point that the functionality really is quite limited and the effectiveness is limited. Yet at the same time, anecdotally, I still hear a lot of people saying that they don't trust the government right now. But again, I think a lot of that comes from this COVID fatigue, the conspiracy theories that we're seeing around COVID and other things in the world, and that people can kind of live in their own reality. So I think building trust is really crucial, and the way that governments and public health authorities do that is just by being really, really honest with the public. I think a lot of times governments feel like it's in the best interest of the public to hold things back. I don't think that that's helpful. I think that just creates mistrust and it feeds into the conspiracy theories.
What do you all think will unfold, given the importance of that trust, when the dominant purveyors of the technology underpinning these kinds of government-issued tooling are technology companies that are notoriously bad about generating public trust in the modern era, at least in how they're viewed presently. I think that the evolution towards distrust of big technology is fairly recent, but it's certainly palpable, and I wonder what that means on the evolution of the industry.
Well, if I may just go ahead, James. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say it's an interesting point, but I think much though, whilst those of us who are really interested in tech policy may have a tendency to ask questions about the tech giants and not trust some of their motivations, I actually think these companies are incredibly trusted. They're incredibly successful at gathering the trust of users. And I actually think probably in the long run, to my mind, one of the more interesting trends is if these entities get more trust and states and previous structured organization get less and less, what then? Do these companies start taking on the elements of statehood? That's kind of what I think has happened to a very small extent. You can certainly overstate it, but I think that's happened to an extent right now. Two large companies that have markets were able to set and regulate the terms of the market and use their market regulations to determine a public health response for millions, billions indeed, of people. Doesn't that sound rather like state activity on some level?
If I may just respond to that, I think, this whole notion of, post-sovereign nation world, has been going on.
You all into silence, or my internet is broken down.
If it comes back, just listen on. We're going to give it back to Youngjin for a second.
Yeah, can you hear me all right? Okay, so I think this whole, sovereign nation sort of world has been around with us for a while. Global trade agreement, that we see, all around, has been a, formal recognition that, the sovereign nations give up and say, hey, you guys, multinationals, you can move around and stuff and people at your will. Now we are seeing from a political process the blowback of that, and how so we are in a correction process, and then I think that we are seeing the correction process in social media space to a certain extent, and I think we are seeing a little bit less, but still in the App Store control, the monopoly power of Apple and Google. I think we are seeing that as well. So I trust that collective wisdom of the market and the public in a way, and they're sort of moderating the force of it. May take time. There are a lot of damages that are being done in the meantime, but I think in the long run, the pendulum will swing back and moderate, I think. So that's, I think, where we are heading at, and I think we also need to think about, this contact tracing is just one of many other technologies that are influencing the way people behave. As Shaun mentioned, this mistrust and fake news and conspiracy theory are actually popularized through social media websites. And there is a correction. I think people are seriously thinking about the way these algorithms are behaving. But it's not new, right? Vaccine, anti-vaccine movement, conspiracy, all fueled through this social media space. We are seeing the same thing. It is just more imminent to us and more urgent to to the society. So I think that's where I think things are. The last thing I'd like to say is that what I see is that the technologists tend to think that we're going to build a technology, and these social issues like privacy and ethics and the equity issues are consequences that we need to regulate through policies and so on. And I think the technologists are beginning to realize that we cannot leave it out, and to earn the trust from the public and users, we actually need to change the architecture of the technology that embraces these principles and by design from the very beginning. I think that's a big move, and I think you could correct market failure in two ways. You can actually use that as an opportunity to create new products that directly addresses that problem, or you lean on the policy changes and to government intervention. I think that's what we are seeing both ends, and so I think it is actually interesting to see how things will pan
I
out.
agree. With that in mind, Professor Yoo, are there global lessons that you think we can take away from like how the pandemic has been responded to in terms of digital health? Professor Yoo, can you hear me?
Yeah. So, I
Right.
wasn't sure you're asking me. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, I think when technology is effectively used, I think with some countries like China and South Korea come to my mind. When either public suspends their commitment for privacy, or give a blind trust to government and technology, the technology can be remarkably effective, right? And you look at China, they are now just almost COVID free, and their economic activity is now in full swing. And my friends in South Korea complaining about air quality. That is indication that Chinese factories are well and alive. South Korea and people are having almost normal lives, and so on. So these are the examples. Now, it came at a huge expense of the privacy and civil liberties and so on. So what I think we can learn from it is that we really need to think about how might we create a technology implementation that could amplify this effectiveness, because those small cases demonstrated that technology can be effective. It's not just the realm of theory, right? It does work. But the question is, how do we make it implemented and adopted by the users and the public, right? So that, I think, is the biggest lesson that we can learn from, that there is actually a real live case that demonstrates that it does work.
Shaun, what would you say are some of the global lessons we should take away, especially from a privacy framework?
Well, this may be, so first of all, I'm not a privacy advocate. I practice in this area, and I find it a really interesting, important area of law. Part of our social contract and being part of society is that we have to give up some of our privacy. That's just fundamental. So this idea that we can't sacrifice or give up any of our privacy is just an extreme position that doesn't work with society. But I think to make James's point about the sort of power of Google and Apple, Alberta, one of our provinces, tried to go a slightly different way with what they saw as a slightly more effective model, but they weren't authorized to use that layer. So they have all kinds of technical problems, to the point where, according to some reports in the media, it's just broken, and it doesn't work at all. So this seems to me like a problem that kind of cries out for coordination among governments, because Apple and Google have this kind of, I guess, potentially a divide and conquer approach, because they're not even really, at least in North America, they're not dealing with national governments, because national governments don't implement these things on the ground level. They're dealing with provinces or regions or states, or even at a lower level than that. So I think that there needs to be maybe some coordination among governments on what is an ideal technological approach, and how do we make this happen with the devices. If we're going to use apps and smartphones, how do we make this as a technology that works, that's equitable, that is privacy respective, but also accomplishes some of the public health objectives that we need to facilitate?
Do you have any insights or thoughts on why that level of integration and cooperation wasn't easy to accomplish the first time around at the governmental level, either between provinces and the federal level, or between some of the different countries?
Oh, it just hit us so quick. No one was prepared, and everyone had different ideas about what these apps could do. There was no chance. There was some disagreement in Canada about which way to go, and some of the provinces wanted to move earlier with their own exposure notification apps, but the federal government required them to wait, because they essentially had a veto, because there's a preference for national approaches. So there was no chance for any coordination. I think that's one of the really important things that should come out of this pandemic is what can we learn from it, and how do we be more prepared with a coordinated approach to the use of technology going forward.
I agree. We're going to move into customer or participant questions in a second. Before we do, James, did you have any last words you'd like to add on sort of global learnings or on any of the stuff that you've been able to see from your vantage point? I'll stress that all three of us are sitting at this, or all three of you rather, are sitting at this from ever so slightly different, admittedly all Western, but still different perspectives. You know, Professor Yoo, you're in America. Shaun, you're in Canada, and James, your home base is in the UK. James, did you have any final sort of thoughts about what the global learnings might be?
I kind of want to give a slightly gnomic answer. It's too early to tell, really. At best, we know that trust is an issue. We know that a lot of these applications have been botched. If the virus carries on, or if a more deadly virus that also spreads this rapidly comes through, then we're going to have different systems. And you'll see an increasing emphasis on wearables. And it'll be very interesting to see the policy debates that emerge around those.
You know, Jonathan, if I may just add one quick thought. I think one thing that we learn is that, you know, the nature of this global pandemic, the global standard and integration, data sharing is so important. You know, so even if you have a system that works great, you know, in one part of the world, that information, you know, that we have about my risk profile or whatever cannot travel with me or shared with other agencies. You know, our global transactions will still be very limited. So I think one thing that we need is such global, you know, I don't know whether standard but some form of integration. I think would be
back to talking about trust again, isn't it? There's no way of translating that trust across borders, and we need to find a way to solve that. Yeah.
Right.
We've had a number of interesting questions from participants. I'm going to start moving into those for 10 minutes, if that's okay. The first one is whether or not we need a collaborative effort to put together a high-level technology that uses, a high-level technology-independent requirements spec, and then sort of crowdsource it and use open source as a way of empowering it. Do you guys have any takes on how that kind of technology approach might have been able to improve upon some of the challenges that we've seen either with nationalism or with the lack of efficacy out of the frameworks that were put forward by Google and Apple?
Just on the collaborative effort point, I actually think one of the most... am I actually speaking here? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay, good, because I was chatting very eloquently into the void for about 5 minutes at one point earlier today. Yeah, so I think one of the more heartening elements of the entire crisis has been precisely this kind of collaborative effort. You've seen scientists and people from tech backgrounds, developers, data scientists, coders of various stripe, coming together repeatedly to create frameworks for new applications and portions of applications and protocols for those applications throughout the epidemic. So actually, you know, that has happened, and I think that will continue to happen in various different forms. The question really is what decisions get made about rollout, and what do institutions actually choose to go with as institutions, and what does the market, what do people's choices actually lead them towards? But I think collaboration has been an excellent feature.
You know, my quick answer is that we do have it. It is called science. You know, if you look at the way science is being done, it's crowdsourcing. Everyone has an idea, we do it. And then, you know, the way these magazines and science journals respond to this pandemic, I think is nothing but remarkable. You know, they changes the way we view, you know, making editorial decisions in a very effective way, recognizing the urgency. And then scientific community also has done incredible amount of work. Did it work as fast as it should and could? And I don't think so. I mean, there's a lot of institutional baggages and liabilities that come with scientific endeavor. And to a certain extent, it is there to protect, you know, the public from wrong kind of scientific activities and so on. But I think I would say that we do have a crowdsourcing and debugging.
Do our governments perhaps have something to learn on that front then, in how these tools can be used and how public health implementation can be executed?
Yeah, absolutely, they do. I think one of the keys here is we've seen so many resources thrown at this pandemic, and I've heard some people argue that we've focused too much on COVID at the expense of other health issues that we're suffering from at the time. I don't have an opinion on that, but I do think that it is going to be really important to be able to sustain that energy and focus and resources, and not just forget about this if and when COVID sort of fades away and it's not directly in our face anymore. That's going to be one of the real challenges, so that we're not just starting over from scratch again. And that requires government leadership and long-term thinking.
Yeah. We had another question here. How do you guys see the integration and validation of rapid home testing integrating into a track and trace application? Anyone want to take that?
I mean, I think the way our tool is designed, the shared trace that we did with James and his team, is that we could report any kind of like a symptom, and so if the home testing is a result of a testing, it's only temporary, but I can share that, and then I can use that as an information to propagate my risk score, calculate my risk score. So I think that's just one additional, perhaps more reliable data source.
Could you, and James, if you want to talk to this as well, I'd be interested in your take. Could you guys speak to what risk scoring might do if it were to become more widely adopted than exposure notification as it is now, and what the impact of a more pervasive testing regime might do for the accuracy of risk scoring in general?
So risk score is essentially what we would say, in computer science is inferencing. So the true state of someone's current condition is unknown and to a certain extent unknowable until we actually do the testing. But even after testing, that condition may change. What we do is that there are a set of a partially observable trace data that we can collect, a different kind of trace data. It is about interaction. It could be your breath and respiratory. There are a lot of observable data that are event data. And what we are trying to do is we are inferring unobservable latent status data using this visible data, right? So the availability of these more widely available trace data simply increases reliability of our ability to infer the unobservable data. And also what it does is that it could make the score more robust, meaning that some people may try to cheat the system. I really need to go to work, and therefore I'm going to say that I'm fine, even though I don't feel fine. And when everybody around that person says, they don't feel right, and then that person's score will be moderated based on what other people report. So the whole network effect and then creating an inference score actually would be better, one would argue, than self-reported symptom scores in that sense.
Yes, absolutely.
I'll let James go ahead. Okay, I was just gonna make a quick comment that to me it sounds like potentially a great and useful approach, but the concerns that you would see from privacy advocates on that is the potential for function creep. Yeah. How long is this used? Does it eventually creep into a technology that's always in our lives? So we're using it every cold, flu season, sexually transmitted infections, so that we always have this infectious risk score following us around. So that's a really crucial thing, is defining the scope of this, when it's used, when it isn't, who gets access to the data, and for how long is it retained.
Shaun, it is really interesting. We already had to say no once to another application of the technology in a particular domain because of precisely that concern. Absolutely.
Yes, I think it ultimately comes down to what we need as a society. Right now, the apps presume, the exposure notification apps that are the most popular at present presume that there is widespread testing, which isn't necessarily the case in every place, or that the testing, if it does come, is timely. And they also presume that individuals will voluntarily write in what data they have, so whether or not they got positive. And they also presume that the Bluetooth mechanisms used in the exposure tools are actually any good at seeing who they've been in the room with, which also, frankly, really isn't a given. Trinity College Dublin did an excellent study that showed users on French and German trains picking one another up. It might as well have been random, to be entirely honest with you. Very striking study. So what risk scoring does, particularly if it's symptom-based or by some other sets of data, it allows you, as Youngin says, to make an inference. And depending upon how you construct the architecture, it can be more reliable over time. And it also, it takes away that kind of ability of people to just not say whether or not they had a test. People we suspect to be more comfortable updating their score, particularly if an individual's score is, symptom score, say, is also impacted by the symptom scores of people they encounter. So it's more social, therefore, rather than relying on a single individual telling everyone else whether or not they had the test. This mightn't be suitable for every environment, but some workplaces are going to need it. Consider meatpacking plants, for instance. Places where people work very, very tight together in hot, humid environments. Meatpacking plants have been, all over the world, have had outbreaks. Those kind of environments need different kind of solutions to exposure notifications, and risk scoring could be one way for them.
This conversation talking about all the things that we still had to learn, and hoping that this would sort of point us in the direction of sort of a better response or a faster response or a more effective response for the next pandemic. And it feels a little bit like those are some of the items that we're really talking about here. There's different kinds of exposure notification required for different environments. In some cases, exposure notification isn't sufficient. You need risk scoring instead. And if you need those things, then you have to be able to deal with a different set of privacy issues than you had in other circumstances. And I think if there are key takeaways for the kind of conversation that we're having here, it's those sorts of things. I might ask one more question just because I thought it was an interesting take on one of the takeaways that you guys had all elucidated. And that was that if we're intersecting trust with sort of changing landscapes in sovereignty here, I wonder what kinds of organizations might emerge in the future or might already exist that will take on this role in the future, that will help to overcome trust, not on a national or a regional level, but on an international level. And I might use this as an opportunity to ask each of you if you have any take on which of those organizations are interesting in that kind of a context, and then also to say if you have any predictions as to where you think this will go over the next couple months or years around international trust. I'd love to hear what they might be. Maybe I'll start with you, Professor Yoo, and then go to James and Shaun the way we started it out. And then I'll take this opportunity as well to say thank you to everyone for participating, because this will be our last question. Professor Yoo.
Yeah, so my take on this is that we have to absolutely resist any temptation to create top to bottom full stack specification of it, application by global bureaucratic organization, because history has shown that we are absolutely not able to do such things. And by the time they come up with something, it will probably become, outrageously outdated. Look what happened with the internet. The inventors of the TCP/IP protocol made it very, very thin layer that is absolutely necessary to communicate, to allow flexible generative platform. I think that's what we need. So think and that could become some sort of like if we look at global mobile roundtables, the WCDMA broadband, the protocols are being agreed upon by different players and manufacturers and so on. I think we should think about those kind of approaches and really coming up with an agreement of the minimalistic standard that allows us to share scores, and however they use it, how they create applications, notifications in each different jurisdiction and locale. I think that we shouldn't expect and try to create a global solution. You know, it's a thin layer of interface. That's what I would like to see.
Yes, I think the interface point is a good one. It's one I'd agree with Youngjin on. I think more generally, market mechanisms are the most realistic way of getting rapid proliferation of a particular solution. This gigantic change, but particularly in democracies where legitimacy of states are already being a bit corroded, people just refuse to listen. More broadly, I would be quite skeptical that you would get anything other than maybe just an interface between the application systems of certain countries, because the approaches being taken in different regions are so different. If you consider what's been going on in China versus the standards being set in Europe, versus what's been going on in Korea versus say in India, you know, it's very, very different systems in play. And you know, there'll just be, frankly, sort of firstly philosophical reasons, and then ultimately I think even, you know, heading into geopolitical reasons why people won't play ball on that.
Yeah, I think we're at the lowest level of mistrust in international organizations we ever had. I mean, the U.S. government effectively blamed the World Health Organization for this outbreak in the U.S., right? And there are a lot of people, probably over 70 million people, who would agree with that statement. I think to set a modest goal is even just information sharing. You know, you have a regional health authority in an eastern province who feels like they're working on this alone, but they have counterparts across the country and around the world who are facing the exact same issues, even though they're working in different contexts. So just being able to share and reach out, what worked for you, what didn't work, how can we share information back and forth and make this work better for our own purposes.
I think on that note, you know, technology, for all of the challenges that it's facing on eHealthcare and in contact tracing and the other tooling that we all talked about, you know, it's got a very big role to play just in bringing together the different public health authorities that are trying to wrestle with this kind of stuff. And so there's probably some bright light there as well. Thank you very much, Youngjin Yoo, James Kingston, and Shaun Brown for this conversation. I think this was really nice. Great exploration of all of the different topics that are at play here, from trust and technology implementation all the way through to the international dynamics of public health authorities. We're going to stick around for a couple of minutes in the speakers lounge after this. So when the screen shuts down, if you double click on one of the two tables that says speakers lounge, we'd love to meet a couple of the participants. Please stick around for networking as long as you're available. And again, James, Youngjin, Shaun, it was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Well, thank you.